So in 2009, just after the end of the climate conference, it was December, it was cold, there was old bits of newspaper and plastic bags blowing around, and I was on the way over to a Christmas party across a bit of scrap land on the edge of Copenhagen, and I saw through the fence some strange plastic looking boxes that I realised were beehives. In those days we were all going around with a sense of kind of anxiety and depression that was only going to get worse in the following 10 years as inaction on climate change became more and more urgent, or the need to take action on climate change became more and more urgent. And what I didn't know then is that inside these cold, frosty boxes there were tens of thousands of honeybees huddled together, keeping warm, waiting for the sun to come out and the days to get longer and the spring to give them the possibility to come out and pollinate and take flight in the city of Copenhagen. But my curiosity was really stimulated by seeing this, and there's a telephone number on the side of the fence, so I called it and went to meet the beekeeper. And we drank a cup of coffee, and he told me this fantastic story that got me completely obsessed with honeybees. He told me that if you go back in time about 100 million years to the late Cretaceous, then the world was black and white. There were, dinosaurs and bamboo, and people were kind of walking around, or not people, but they were going around eating each other. And one day in this period, the first primitive bee flew from the first primitive flower to the next primitive flower and discovered a new kind of sexual relationship, pollination. This little act, the exchange of pollen from one plant to another via this bee that sucked some kind of primitive nectar from the flower, was the stimulus, the engine behind a massive explosion in biological diversity and evolution. So in the space of just a few tens of millions of years, everything that we associate with the richness of the world today, colour, taste, smell, all the juices of vegetables and fruits, all this, the richness of the flowers that grow on trees and bushes, the era of the angiosperms, the time of the insects and the pollinators, not just honeybees, but thousands of species of mammal, of bat, of animal, emerged out of this relationship between bees and flowers. When I heard the story, I was completely amazed, and it occurred to me that that was a story that I really needed to hear. So I got completely obsessed. I began to find out more about bees. I signed up for a beekeeping course, and I discovered actually that humans and bees have a relationship that goes back tens of thousands of years. There's actually paintings of humans gathering honey on the sides of caves from 40 or 50,000 years ago. You can see throughout history that humans have looked at bees and seen their own societies reflected back in the sniffing and licking and dancing and interactions in these incredibly complex hives. So the ancient Egyptians, for example, for them honey was more valuable than gold, and bees were sacred. The old pharaoh Ramesses III, he made a decree that he sent up and down the Nile that people should gather honey in clay pots and send it to the temple. So people climbed in trees and children dug in the fields and people were stung on their hands and feet and faces, eventually gathering 8 tons of honey that were sailed out into the River Nile and poured into the water as a sacrifice to the gods. You have to imagine at this time that the River Nile, it was the representation of the heavenly on earth. It was the Milky Way. It was everything that was sacred and unifying about the country was represented in this river. So by pouring in the honey and making it sweet, the sweet water flowed over the fields and connected the north to the south and allowed the country to flourish. If you go back again to the ancient Greeks a few thousand years later, they were also taken by bees and saw them as holy. But for them, they saw the pyramid structure of a deciding power and a whole group that conducted the real work of the hive as the defining feature. And they spent a long time searching for the king bee, which they couldn't find. They couldn't understand why it was a queen bee, but the pyramid structure reflected the society that they came from. And this perception continued for thousands of years, right up until the 18th century. So in the 18th century, with the birth of the Industrial Revolution, suddenly the Victorians were fascinated by the worker bees. If you go to Manchester, birthplace of industrial society, you can see that the symbol of the city is the honeybee. You see it printed on street signs and lampposts across the whole city. And for them, the idea of the beehive as a proto-capitalist society, with the workers gathering the wealth from the flowers and passing it on to the enjoyment of the queen, was their perception of how that universe functioned. Until the 1930s, when the German scientist Carl von Frisch, when he looked at bees, he realized that they were much more complex than people had realized before, that they actually had a language, that they danced and communicated through their dance, that there was an enormous amount of organization and communication that happened in the beehive. And his research was so radical that he was blacklisted by the Nazis and spent the entire Second World War watching his dancing bees in a summer house in Austria, while the rest of the world literally burned around him through the Second World War. But as a result of his research, we discovered that bees are actually democratic. And in the 70s, just with the rise of management, we learned from bees that the democratic systems of organization are, again, incredibly beautiful and complex, and that they dance to communicate their decisions and take decisions based on the dancers with the greatest enthusiasm. So the question is, when we started this project, when we looked at these bees at this time when we're facing unprecedented environmental change, huge changes in our welfare society and in our way of organizing ourselves, what can we learn from the bees now? What do we need to look at? What can we see in them that we can take back to our own society? And I think that the fundamental question that human beings have to answer today is simply the question of how we can live together on a planet with other species in a way that contributes to the flourishing of human relationships, of other species, of spaces and people, so that in our way of consuming and producing and organizing, we're making a richer environment and more inclusive communities, instead of the destruction and the simplification and the vulnerability that we're building into our system that we have now. And this is what lies behind our project in Bybi. For us, we want to use every beehive and every bee as a catalyst for creating richer communities and for a richer environment. For us, we want to convert passive consumers into active co-producers, so that the gift that is the honey that we get from the bees flows onwards into the system to encourage people to plant more flowers, to connect with each other, to learn and be curious about the magical world that honeybees can offer us. And this is what we've been doing throughout our project. So you can see, for example, in some of the businesses that we work with, we start by putting beehives on the roof, and we work together with Syrian refugees who look after the bees. They go into the businesses and they knock on the door, and they go up onto the rooftops or into the yard to look over the bees, and through that they begin to create relationships with the employees. And now we have several places where it started with the bees. We get contacted to find out what else can they do. They plant flowers, they create spaces where not just honeybees but other kinds of insects can thrive. They plant fruit trees and berries, so employees and passers-by begin to pick the flowers and give them to each other. Each flower, each initiative has an impact on the taste and the colour of the honey. And this means that when we do it in 20 or 30 or 50 places across the city, we begin to build up a map of colours and tastes and smells and relationships in every spoonful of honey that gets produced. And we can use this to communicate with people in different ways. So we also work with social projects, with artists, with dancers, with musicians, with researchers, so that each glass of honey literally captures a story about the climate in that particular year, about the people who've been helping to make it, about the flowers that have been planted in order to make this particular glass of honey, and about all the things that it can be used for afterwards. That is why we say honey is something we make together, and that is why in this project bees, people, honey, flowers and pollination can contribute to a richer environment and inclusive communities across different species and across different populations.